have woman?
You have woman?
Mitakuyepi, hihani waste. Hechetuelo.
Toke ya.
They are 2 for $1, little one.
The first sound you hear in hell is the ringing of iron on iron. Clang, clang, clang. That's what the old-timers say anyway. But Elias Thorne figured he'd been living in his own version of hell for 30 years, and the sound didn't bother him much anymore. In fact, on cold mornings, when the forge wasn't yet hot enough to hurt, he missed it. The sun rose red as molten steel over Fort Laramie that September morning in 1857, and Elias was already at his anvil, his massive shoulders hunched over a piece of white-hot iron that would become a wagon axle by noon if the customer paid. If not, it would stay cooling on the rack with all the other unpaid work, a silent testament to the fact that on the frontier, a man's word wasn't always worth the breath it took to speak it. At 58, Elias Thorne was what the territory made of men who survived it, bent but not broken deaf in one ear from 3 decades of hammer, strikes his hands so calloused and stained with forge soot that no amount of lye soap could ever bring back their original color. His back curved like a question mark from years of bending over the anvil, and when he straightened, which he did now squinting at the wagon train forming up outside the fort's walls, vertebrae popped like green wood in a fire. He didn't wear a gun. Never had. A gun was a tool for killing at a distance, and Elias Thorne had never killed anything farther away than arm's length. He didn't need to. Any fool drunk enough or stupid enough to start trouble in a blacksmith shop quickly learned that a man who could grip white-hot iron with tongs could do considerably worse damage with his bare hands if pressed. Besides, in a room full of hammers, chisels, and iron rods, heated to temperatures that could melt lead firearms, seemed almost quaint. His weapon of choice sat cooling in a bucket of water nearby, a 3-pound cross-peen hammer with a handle he'd shaped himself from seasoned hickory. It had cracked skulls, broken ribs, and once, though he didn't like to remember, it shattered a man's kneecap so thoroughly that the fool walked with a limp for the rest of his considerably shortened life. The coffee on the edge of his forge burbled black and thick as river mud. Arbuckle's the only brand worth drinking strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe nail if you left one in the cup long enough. He poured himself a tin cup full and drank it scalding hot, the only way he could still taste anything after years of inhaling metallic smoke and coal dust. "Sun's up, fire's red, time to earn your bread," he muttered to himself, the same words his own master had taught him 40 years ago in a shop outside Philadelphia, before the West was even a whisper in most men's minds. Outside Fort Laramie was waking up. Teamsters cursed their oxen. Soldiers drilled in formations that would have made their commanders back east weep. And somewhere beyond the fort's walls, the Lakota were breaking camp, preparing for the fall hunt that would determine whether their people ate well through the coming winter or starved slowly wrapped in buffalo robes that grew thinner every year as the great herds diminished. Elias knew the Lakota, knew them better than most white men in the territory. He'd been shoeing their horses and repairing their rifle locks for 15 years, ever since the fort had been established as a trading post and way station. He understood maybe 24 words of their language, mostly the important ones like broken fixed price and whiskey, but he understood their craftsmanship, understood the way they could work leather and sinew with a precision that would shame half the cobblers in Boston, understood that they valued practical skill over pretty words, which suited him just fine. What he didn't understand was why one of them was walking straight toward his shop at this ungodly hour, carrying what looked like a bundle of buffalo robes so large it blocked out half her body. Her. Even from 30 yards away, he could tell it was a woman by the way she walked, Not the hip-swaying glide of the fort's prostitutes or the corseted mints of officers' wives, but the efficient ground-eating stride of someone who'd walked 1,000 miles and expected to walk 1,000 more before she died. She was middle-aged, maybe 35, maybe 40, hard to tell with Indian women who worked outdoors their whole lives. Her face had the weathered quality of cured leather, and her hands, visible even from this distance, were rope-scarred and stained with what he recognized as brain-tanning residue. A worker's hands. Hands like his own. She stopped at the entrance to his shop, and for a long moment they simply studied each other. Her eyes were dark as forged coal and just as hard to read. She wore a dress of deerskin decorated with a geometric pattern of blue and white beadwork, expensive work, the kind that took months, but it was worn at the elbows and hem. A woman who'd known better times, or at least different ones. "Oh," she said, finally holding up a bone tool that had snapped clean in half. "Fix." Her English was minimal, but her meaning was clear. Elias took the broken awl, a punch used for making holes in leather, and examined it. The break was clean straight through the shaft, where the bone had simply given out after years of stress. He shook his head. "Can't fix bone. Too brittle. Need new one." She nodded, unsurprised, and reached into a leather bag at her hip. She pulled out what he first thought were beads, but then recognized as raw garnets, semi-precious stones, probably panned from a creek bed somewhere up in the mountains. Enough to buy a new bone awl, certainly. Maybe even two. But Elias Thorne was looking at her hands. They were destroyed. Years of pushing bone and wood awls through tough buffalo hide had left them scarred and calloused, with fresh cuts still healing around the fingernails. He'd seen hands like that before, the hands of seamstresses back east who worked in factories for pennies a day until their fingers literally wore out. He made a decision he'd regret later, or perhaps not regret at all. "Keep your stones," he said, and turned to his scrap pile. The woman watched confused as he selected a piece of high-carbon steel, a broken file he'd been saving for something special. He thrust it into the coals, worked the bellows until the metal glowed cherry red, then orange, then nearly white. With practiced efficiency, he hammered it out on the anvil, drawing the metal into a long, tapered point. He shaped a handle from scrap brass, riveted it in place, and finally, when the metal had cooled enough, he ground the point on his whetstone until it could split a hair. The entire process took maybe 20 minutes. When he finished, he held up the steel awl to the morning light. It gleamed like a fragment of captured sun. "Steel," he said, handing it to her. "Won't break. Won't dull. Work 5 times faster." The woman took the awl, carefully testing the point with her thumb. A single drop of blood welled up bright red. She looked at the tool, then at him, back at the tool. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight he'd rarely heard in any language. Why, it was the right question. Why give away quality work? Why help a stranger? Why care about an Indian woman's destroyed hands, when half the territory would happily see her entire people driven into the ground? Elias poured himself another cup of coffee, this one so hot it nearly blistered his tongue, and considered his answer carefully. "Because," he said finally, "I'm tired of seeing good work done with poor tools. Makes the world uglier than it needs to be." Something changed in her face. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes that suggested she understood more than just his words. She tucked the awl into her belt with the reverence some men reserve for their first rifle, then carefully counted out half the garnets she'd brought and placed them on his workbench. "Trade," she said firmly. "Not gift. Trade fair." Elias nodded. "Fair enough. A transaction both could live with." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Makwa," she said, tapping her chest. "My name. Mean bear in my language." "Elias," he replied, "means the Lord is my God, though I haven't seen much evidence of that particular claim in these parts." For the first time, she did smile, a quick flash of humor, that transformed her weathered face into something younger, fiercer. "Your God make bad blacksmith," she said. "You better." And then she was gone, walking back toward the Lakota camp with her bundle of buffalo robes, leaving Elias standing in his shop with a handful of garnets and the distinct feeling that something significant had just happened, though he couldn't quite name what. Makwa came back 3 days later. This time, she brought work 6 buffalo hides in various stages of preparation, from raw and stiff as boards to beautifully brain-tanned and soft as cloth. She spread them out on the dirt floor of his shop with the practiced efficiency of a merchant laying out valuable inventory, which Elias realized was exactly what she was. "Trade," she said, pointing to the hides, then to his shop's meager selection of finished goods: horseshoes, nails, knife blades, pot hooks. Elias examined the hides carefully. 3 were prime winter robes, thick with the kind of dense undercoat that kept buffalo warm at 40 below zero. The other 3 were summer skins, thinner and less valuable. But all 6 showed the unmistakable signs of expert preparation. The flesh side was scraped so clean it was nearly white. The hair side still had the natural oils that made it waterproof. And on 2 of the winter robes, she'd painted geometric designs in vermilion and yellow ochre, stylized representations of what he thought might be buffalo and horses. "Good work," he said honestly. "Best I've seen in 5 years." She nodded, accepting the compliment as her due. 5 hides, she said, pointing to the group. 1 bad. She indicated a summer skin with a hole near the center, probably a bullet hole from the kill shot. But when Elias looked closer, he nearly laughed. The hole had been repaired so skillfully that only by running his fingers over the hide could he detect the repair. She'd used sinew thread finer than human hair working from the flesh side, so the stitches barely showed on the hair side. Then she'd combed the surrounding fur to cover the repair line and rubbed fat into the area to blend the color. In the dim light of a trading post, a casual buyer might never notice. Hell, even a careful buyer might miss it. "Not bad," he said. "Just wounded. Like a soldier who fights on anyway." She grinned at that, a full, genuine smile that made her look almost girlish. "You see good. Most white men too stupid." Most white men, Elias agreed, are too stupid about a lot of things. They settled into negotiation. Not with many words, neither of them had the vocabulary for that, but with gestures, comparisons, and the occasional grunt of agreement or disapproval. By the time the sun reached its zenith, they'd struck a bargain: all 6 hides in exchange for 2 iron scrapers, a box of steel needles fine enough for bedwork, and a cooking pot he'd been holding for a customer who died of cholera before he could pick it up. Fair value for both sides. Maybe even slightly in her favor, but Elias didn't mind. Quality deserved quality. As she was bundling up her new tools, she spoke again. "You have woman." "Had one," Elias said. "Died 20 years ago. Cholera, same as half this territory." "You want new woman?" The directness of the question would have shocked most men, but Elias had been on the frontier long enough to understand that Indians approached marriage differently. It was a practical arrangement, not a romantic fantasy. 2 people with complementary skills who could help each other survive. Love, if it came at all, came later, built slowly through shared work and mutual respect, like a good knife forged layer by layer. He studied her. Not a young woman, but strong. Capable. Her hands told the story of someone who'd worked hard her whole life and would keep working until she dropped. And there was intelligence in her eyes, the kind of sharp, practical intelligence that saw through bullshit to the truth beneath. "Why you ask?" She shrugged. "I divorced bad husband 2 moons ago. Lazy. Drunk too much. I throw his things from teepee. Now I have no husband, no protector. Winter coming." She gestured to the fort around them. "Here white man rules. I need white man husband. You need women who work hard, make good robes to sell, talk to Lakota when they come trade. It was, Elias thought, probably the most honest marriage proposal he'd ever heard. No flowers, no poetry, no promises of eternal devotion. Just practical recognition of mutual need. I'm 58 years old, he said. I'm half deaf from the forge. My back's so crooked I can't stand up straight anymore. I've got the temperament of a pissed-off badger, and I don't plan on changing anytime soon. I'm 38, Makwa replied. I work so hard my hands bleed. I have sharp tongue that make men angry, and I snore like grizzly bear with head cold. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then simultaneously they both started laughing, not polite chuckles, but deep belly laughs that echoed off the walls of the shop. We make terrible couple, Elias said when he could breathe again. Yes, Makwa agreed, but we make good team. And that, Elias thought, was perhaps the truest thing anyone had ever said to him. The marriage ceremony happened according to the old country-style la fa en deux pas, as the French trappers called it. No preacher, no church, no Bible verses about submission and obedience. Just a practical exchange witnessed by those who mattered. Elias went to Makwa's father, an elderly Lakota named Swift Hawk, who'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite years ago, but still had the bearing of a warrior. Through a mixture of sign language, broken English, and sheer determination, Elias made his offer: 1 horse, 2 new butcher knives, a steel scraping blade, and a bolt of red trade cloth from Makwa's hand in marriage. It was a substantial bride price, far more than a divorced woman normally commanded, and Swift Hawk knew it. But after examining Elias with eyes that had seen 60 winters, the old man nodded. He recognized quality when he saw it, whether in horseflesh, steel, or men. The wedding feast was a modest affair. Some boiled beef, coffee, and a loaf of bread Elias had traded for that morning. But what made it memorable was the moment when Swift Hawk stood and spoke in Lakota, his words translated haltingly by a mixed-blood interpreter. My daughter is not a young girl who dreams of romance, Swift Hawk said. She is a woman who has walked through fire and come out stronger. She can work leather until her fingers bleed. She can survive on nothing but roots and courage. She is worth 10 horses, but this man offers only 1. He paused dramatically, but he offers it with respect. He sees her as a person, not property. Therefore, I accept. Elias understood perhaps 1 word in 5, but he got the essential meaning. He nodded to Swift Hawk, then turned to Makwa. I won't pretend to love you, he said quietly, but I'll respect you. I'll share what I have, and I'll defend you with everything I've got. Makwa's response was equally pragmatic. I won't pretend to be white woman who stays inside and looks pretty. But I'll work hard. I'll make us rich with robes and trading, and I'll keep you alive when your stubbornness tries to kill you. They shook hands like business partners, which in many ways they were. The first month of their marriage was an education for both parties. Makwa moved into the small room behind Elias's shop, a space barely large enough for a bed, a trunk, and a table. She looked around at the bare walls, the dirt floor, the complete lack of anything resembling comfort, and simply nodded. I've lived in worse, she said. At least here roof doesn't leak. She transformed the space with methodical efficiency. Within a week, she'd woven willow mats to cover the dirt floor, hung her painted buffalo robes on the walls for insulation, and established a cooking area that could produce meals far superior to the beans and salt pork Elias had been living on. But more importantly, she transformed his business. The first time a group of Lakota warriors came to trade, Elias watched in amazement as Makwa stepped forward and began negotiating in rapid-fire Lakota. The men, some of whom Elias recognized as veteran fighters, listened to her with evident respect. She wasn't deferential or shy. She argued, pointed, even laughed at what must have been a crude joke. After 20 minutes of intense discussion, she turned to Elias. They have 12 horses, need shoes. 6 rifles need fixing. They pay in prime winter robes, 20 robes, all perfect. You do good work, they bring more people next moon. Elias did the math in his head. 20 prime winter robes, properly prepared, could be sold downriver for $3 each. $60 for maybe 3 days' work. That was more than most men in the territory made in 2 months. Tell them yes, he said. And tell them if the work isn't perfect, they don't pay. Makwa grinned and translated. The warriors nodded approvingly. A man who stood behind his work was a man who could be trusted. Over the following weeks, Makwa revealed herself to be not just a worker, but a merchant of formidable skill. She understood things about the hide trade that Elias had never considered, like the fact that beaver pelts were worth more in winter than summer because of the thick underfur, or that a buffalo robe with pictographic paintings could command double the price of a plain one simply because white traders back east wanted authentic Indian artifacts to show off to their friends. She also taught him about her world. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she explained the process of brain tanning, how every animal carried within its skull enough brain matter to tan its own hide, how the oils and enzymes broke down the stiff proteins, how the constant stretching kept the leather supple. Your people waste everything, she said matter-of-factly. You kill buffalo, take tongue and hump meat, leave rest to rot. We use everything. Horns for spoons, bones for tools, sinew for thread, bladder for water bags, hide for robes, lodges, clothes, ropes. Nothing wasted. Elias, who'd spent 30 years turning scrap iron into useful tools, understood perfectly. Waste is a sin, he agreed, whether you're wasting buffalo or steel. In turn, he taught her about his craft. She watched fascinated as he explained how different temperatures changed steel's properties, how white-hot iron could be forged and shaped, how cherry-red steel could be bent, how straw-colored metal had been tempered to hold an edge. Like cooking, she said. Too hot meat burns. Too cold meat raw. Just right meat perfect. Exactly like cooking, Elias agreed. Just with higher stakes if you screw it up. She also learned to love coffee. At first, she'd wrinkled her nose at the bitter brew, but Elias showed her the white man's trick, adding sugar. Within a week, she was drinking it as black and strong as he did, claiming the sugar made her teeth hurt. Good, he said approvingly. Coffee's supposed to hurt. If it doesn't hurt, it's not doing its job. Their relationship remained businesslike and pragmatic, but small moments of genuine affection began to creep in. When Makwa's hands were so raw from scraping hides that they bled, Elias made her a pair of steel scrapers with handles wrapped in soft leather fitted precisely to her grip. When Elias's back seized up from too many hours at the anvil, Makwa built a sweat lodge behind the shop and spent an hour working the knots out of his muscles with a combination of heat and pressure that felt like torture and salvation in equal measure. One evening, as she was doing intricate beadwork on a pair of moccasins by firelight, Elias noticed her squinting and struggling with the tiny glass beads. The next day, he spent hours at his anvil, carefully forging a set of needle-fine steel awls of varying sizes and a pair of tweezers delicate enough to handle seed beads. When he presented them to her wrapped in a scrap of trade cloth, she looked at the tools for a long moment before speaking. "These are beautiful," she said quietly. "Better than anything I've ever seen." "Well," Elias said, feeling oddly uncomfortable with the praise, "can't have you going blind trying to thread beads with bone tools. Bad for business." She looked up at him then, and he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, not love exactly, but something close. Respect mixed with gratitude and maybe the beginning of genuine caring. "You are strange white man," she said. "You treat me like person, not property. Like partner, not slave." "You work as hard as I do," Elias replied. "Maybe harder." "Why would I treat you any different because most men do?" Makwa said simply. "White men, Indian men, most of them same. Think women only good for cooking, cleaning, and warming bed. Then most men are fools, Elias said. And I've never had much patience for fools. That night, for the first time, they slept in the same bed, not out of obligation, but out of choice, seeking warmth and comfort in each other's presence as winter's first snow began to fall outside. The trouble arrived in mid-November, riding in a freight wagon loaded with barrels and pulled by horses so overworked their ribs showed through their hides. Elias was shoeing a cavalry mount when the wagon rumbled into the fort's compound. He looked up from his work and felt his gut tighten. He recognized the type of men instantly, not by their faces, but by their bearing. These were predators in human form, the kind who'd found ways to profit from other people's misery. There were 4 of them. The leader was a tall man with a scar that ran from his left ear down to his collarbone, probably a knife fight he'd barely survived. He had the cold eyes of a man who'd done things that would make decent people sick and felt no remorse about any of it. The others were standard frontier trash, unwashed, armed to the teeth, and radiating the casual cruelty of men who'd discovered that violence was easier than honest work. The scarred man, someone later told Elias, his name was Silas Vane, dismounted, and immediately started bellowing orders. "You blacksmith, get over here. We need work done, and we need it now." Elias finished hammering in the nail he'd been working on, tested the shoe to make sure it was secure, then slowly straightened up. He moved deliberately slowly these days, partially because his back made quick movements painful, and partially because moving slowly made aggressive men impatient and impatient men made mistakes. "Shop's right there," he said, pointing. "I'll be with you when I finish this horse." Vane's face darkened. "I said, N-O-W, you deaf old bastard. We've got business downriver and we're not wasting time while you fuss over some army nag." Elias was in fact partially deaf, the result of 30 years of hammering metal without any thought to protecting his hearing. But he understood every word Vane said. He just didn't care. "Horse first," he said flatly. "Then you. That's the order folks are served in my shop." For a moment, it looked like Vane might pull the pistol holstered on his hip. His hand even drifted toward it. But then he saw something in Elias's eyes, or maybe he saw the 3-pound hammer Elias was still holding and thought better of it. "Fine," he snarled. "But we're not paying extra for making us wait." "Didn't plan on charging extra," Elias replied. "Just plan on charging what the work's worth." He finished with the cavalry horse, collected his payment from the grateful soldier, and then turned his full attention to the wagon. It didn't take long to diagnose the problem. The rear axle had cracked, not surprising given that the wagon was grossly overloaded. The wood had split cleanly where it met the iron sleeve, and the sleeve itself showed stress fractures. "Need a new axle," Elias said. "This one's done." "Just patch it," Vane said. "We only need it to last another 50 miles. "Can't patch it. Wood's split. Needs replacement." "Then replace it," Vane snapped. How long? Elias did the math. Selecting proper wood, shaping it, fitting the iron sleeve, letting everything cool properly, at least a full day, probably longer. "Day and a half," he said. "Maybe 2 days to do it right?" "Too long. We'll pay double if you do it in 1 day." That should have been Elias's first warning. Nobody offered to pay double unless they were in a desperate hurry, and desperate hurries usually meant something illegal or dangerous or both. "Can be done in 1 day," Elias said slowly. "But the work won't be as good. Won't last as long. Don't need it to last. Just need it to get us downriver." That was Elias's second warning. But he needed the money. Winter was coming, and while Makwa's trading had been profitable, you could never have too much saved up when the snows came and business slowed. $30, he said. That was 3 times his usual rate, but if they wanted speed over quality, they could pay for it. 20, Vane countered. 30, Elias repeated. "Price isn't negotiable." Vane glared at him but nodded. "Fine. 30. But we stay here while you work. Don't trust leaving our cargo unguarded." That's when Elias got his third warning. He'd been so focused on the wagon that he hadn't paid attention to what was in the wagon. Now he really looked and felt his stomach turn. Barrels. Dozens of them, small wooden kegs marked only with crude X's burned into the wood. And leaking from one of them a thin trickle of clear liquid that smelled like industrial alcohol mixed with something sweet and chemical. Whiskey traders, or rather poison merchants. They were selling the kind of rotgut that killed Indians by the dozens, pure alcohol cut with river water, chili peppers for bite and molasses for sweetness. The kind of poison that turned proud warriors into stumbling addicts, that destroyed families and shattered communities more effectively than any army ever could. Elias had seen what whiskey did to the tribes. He'd watched it happen over 15 years, the slow collapse of societies that had survived for thousands of years, brought low not by bullets, but by bottles. And these men were the ones who profited from it. But they were also customers. And Elias Thorne, for all his principles, was a blacksmith who needed to eat. "Fine," he said. $30. Cash before I start. "Half now, half when we leave," Vane said. "All now," Elias replied. "Or find another blacksmith." They stared at each other, two predators sizing each other up. Finally Vane laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "Stubborn old bastard. Fine. 30 now." He counted out the bill's genuine greenbacks, which itself was suspicious, and slapped them into Elias's soot-stained palm. As Elias turned to begin work, Vane called out, "Hey blacksmith, how about a bonus transaction? I'll trade you a barrel of the good stuff for that Indian squaw I saw going into your shop earlier. Fair trade, she's past her prime and my boys could use some entertainment." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. One of Vane's men laughed, a high wheezing sound that suggested either stupidity or too much of his own poison. Elias turned slowly. His hand tightened on the hammer handle until his knuckles turned white under the soot stains. "The woman," he said in a voice that could have etched steel, "is my wife. And if you or any of your boys go near her, I'll use this hammer to drive your skull so far down into your spine that they'll have to dig a 10-foot hole just to bury you proper." The laughter died. Vane's hand drifted toward his pistol again, but something in Elias's eyes stopped him. Maybe he saw murder there, not the hot anger of a young man, but the cold, calculated certainty of someone who'd already decided that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. "Just joking," Vane said finally. "No offense meant." "None taken," Elias lied. "Now if you boys want your wagon fixed, you'll stay out of my way and keep your mouths shut. I work better without distraction." He turned back to the wagon before Vane could respond. But his mind was already racing, working through possibilities and problems with the same methodical precision he used to forge steel. These men were poison merchants. They were rapists and murderers in waiting. And they'd just threatened Makwa, which meant that come tomorrow morning when they rolled out of Fort Laramie with their fixed wagon, they were going to discover that Elias Thorne's definition of fixed wasn't quite what they'd expected. Elias worked into the night, the rhythm of his hammer competing with the drunken shouts of Vane's men. They were too busy poisoning themselves with their own supply to notice the blacksmith's unusual pace. At sunset, Makwa appeared with a pot of stew. She glared at the traders, her face hard as granite. "These are bad men," she said, loud enough for them to hear. "They sell death to my people." "I know," Elias murmured, not looking up. "But they're customers." "Some customers aren't worth having," she snapped, turning to leave. Vane laughed, his voice slurred. "Your squaw's got spirit, blacksmith." "Sure you don't want to trade 2 barrels of whiskey for one night with her?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't look up. He just thrust a pair of tongs into the fire. But the insult settled in the room like smoke. He moved to the final stage, fitting the iron sleeve to the wooden axle. Normally, a blacksmith lets the iron cool slowly in sand, keeping the metal strong and flexible. But tonight Elias changed the recipe. He heated the iron until it glowed a violent orange. He slid it onto the wood, and then, without hesitation, plunged the entire junction into a bucket of ice-cold water. Hiss! Steam exploded upward. The metal screamed silently. The rapid cooling forced the iron to contract violently, creating microscopic internal fractures. To the naked eye, it looked perfect. But inside, the metal had become brittle glass, hard and ready to shatter under the first heavy impact. By midnight, the wagon was ready. "Good work, old man Vane," sneered, inspecting the axle. "Maybe you're worth the money." "Wagon is solid," Elias lied smoothly. "But you should wait until morning. Let the wood settle." "We leave now," Vane insisted. "Moon's bright enough." They rolled out 20 minutes later, the heavy wagon groaning under the weight of the contraband. Elias stood at the gate, watching their taillights fade. Makwa appeared at his elbow. "They will die, probably not," Elias said. "But they're about to have a very long walk." "How do you know it breaks?" Elias smiled, a cold, satisfied expression. "Physics. I cooled the iron too fast. It's brittle now. 5 miles out, there's a rocky wash with a steep drop. The first big bump." He shrugged. "Gravity does the rest." Makwa looked at him, amused. "Your Christian God says to turn the other cheek." "I didn't take revenge," Elias replied innocently. "I just did shoddy work. They should have paid $50 if they wanted quality." Makwa laughed, the sound like wind chimes. "You are my favorite kind of liar," she said. "The kind who lies with the truth." The crash, the news hit Fort Laramie before the men did. 6 miles down the trail, Silas Vane's wagon hadn't just broken, it had self-destructed. The iron sleeve cracked, the wooden axle sheared, and the wagon flipped, launching whiskey barrels into the ravine like cannonballs. The river swallowed the poison, washing it away harmlessly. Vane and his men survived, but their pride didn't. They limped back to the fort, a 6-mile walk of shame, bruised, broke, and murderously angry. The standoff, Elias was at his forge when they staggered in. "You sabotaged us," Vane snarled, his hand shaking near his holster. Elias didn't flinch. "I did the rush job you paid for. Sometimes physics doesn't care about your schedule." Vane drew his pistol, aiming directly at the blacksmith's chest. "I don't need proof, old man. I just need satisfaction." "Pull that trigger," Elias said calmly, "and you hang before sunset. We're in a military fort surrounded by witnesses." Vane hesitated. His finger twitched on the trigger. Then the door creaked open. Makwa stepped out, holding Elias's Sharps buffalo rifle, a weapon designed to drop a bison at 300 yards. She held it casually low at her hip like a broom. "You shoot my husband," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "I shoot you. Then I tell the soldiers you tried to force yourself on me." Soldiers believe a woman over trash every time. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation. Vane looked at the massive gun, then at the gathered crowd. He realized he was outmatched. The verdict, a lieutenant intervened to break the tension, but Elias delivered the final blow. "Come back and I file a federal complaint about unlicensed alcohol sales. The river has your evidence now." Defeated and humiliated, Vane holstered his weapon and retreated. Later, the lieutenant asked quietly, "Did you sabotage it?" "Rush work is never proper work," Elias replied innocently. "Any blacksmith knows that." As the dust settled, Elias looked at his wife. "You would shot them?" "Yes," Makwa said simply. "Poison must be removed." Elias turned back to his anvil. The fire was still hot. He picked up his hammer. Work was honest. Work didn't require explanations. It was truth hammered into shape, one strike at a time. 10 years later, spring sunlight warmed the porch of a home built by iron and will. Elias, his hands now too gnarled to hold a hammer, sat beside Makwa as she sewed. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Marrying a white blacksmith?" Makwa looked toward the corral. There, their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, sharp-eyed and fluent in 3 languages, was already negotiating a trade. She was the bridge between fading traditions and a new world. "The old ways are dying," Makwa said softly, "but our children survive." She carries the best of both worlds. From the smithy, the anvil rang out clang. Clang, the steady heartbeat of creation. The sound of the future. Elias smiled. They weren't heroes in history books. They were simply a man who could forge anything but hate and a woman who refused to break. They proved the West wasn't conquered by bullets, but built by skilled hands and mutual respect. Justice, they learned, doesn't always wear a badge.